Okie dokie, friends. I just wrote and finished my first book. It's called Yes to It All, Stories from the Edges of Love. And I wanted to read you something that I wrote. It's actually the note to the reader, hopefully you. And the chapter's called Where to Start. And when I wrote this, I thought, well, I wanted to share something that would help those of you who are thinking about writing a book, because man, so many people ask me about how I wrote this book, and I hope that this gives you a little bit of inspiration if you're thinking about writing one. So it's called Note to Reader, Where to Start. During the process of writing this memoir, many shared that they too wanted to write a book, but they didn't know where to start. So I wanted to end this book by talking about starting. I had no idea what I would write when I agreed to write this book. Desiree, whom you know by now in this book, convinced me to start writing one. We lived together during the pandemic, and I watched how excited and challenged she was while writing her fourth book. I felt creatively uninspired, hardly touching my camera during the pandemic. Why don't you start writing a book? She suggested. But like all the best advice she's given me, it took me months before I warmed up to the idea. Besides not knowing what my book would be about, I didn't think I had the writing chops to do so. I'm not even a writer, I told Des. Prior to this memoir, I had written a handful of short stories and articles, and I didn't share much of my work to spare myself the embarrassment. The C that my lit professor had given me for my senior thesis stayed with me. I was a mediocre writer at best. By October 2020, though, I was at my wit's end with no creative outlet and bored as hell from the daily walks in the neighborhood. Do you really think I can write a book? I asked Des. Yes. Okay, I'll do it. Really? Yes, but you have to be my writing coach. She said, done. Those of you who have no idea what you want to say or wondering if you have the skills to write a book, I know that I was in the same boat as you. But now that I've completed this book, I can confidently say where to begin yours. The first day I started writing this book, Des and I had just finished eating dinner, and she told me to grab a notebook. I asked, is this our first writing session? Yep, she responds. If you could talk for days on certain topics, what would those be? Write a list of them. On the list of 20 topics, none seemed interesting enough. Who's going to want to hear about any of these things? I asked. Actually, I whined. Just pick one of the topics on that list and write a chapter on that, she said. But how do I even know which one to start with if I don't know what my book is going to be about or what direction I'm going in? Her response is, you won't know until you start. And that's when I was reminded of the anecdote Des had shared with me years ago about Michelangelo's sculpture process. You see, Michelangelo had inherited a gigantic slab of marble that artists abandoned, finding the material unusable. That piece of rejected marble turned into one of the world's greatest masterpieces. Michelangelo said, the sculpture is already complete within the marble block before I start my work. It is already there. I just have to chisel away the superfluous material. Before he began chiseling, he started many of his sculptures with sketches and miniature models. From these initial sketches, he began chiseling away, but not without running into roadblocks. He discovered that his measurements had been wrong, forcing him back to the drawing board to recalculate the proportions he initially made. In some areas, he could alter the sculpture with minor adjustments, while in others, he had to scrap it all together. In essence, he was re-engineering throughout the entire process. Where he started was not where he finished. With that in mind, I decided to sit my ass down at the computer to start making a few sketches for the first chapter. When I started, I felt like I was drinking from a fire hydrant. Ideas spewed out with no hose to direct the flow, nor a filter to parse out the relevant from the crap. But after I let the waters calm, I found a few phrases and scenes I liked and zeroed in on them. I'll fast forward and tell you that by the end of the week, I had one chapter of my book written. Triple fast forwarding, I ended up chopping this chapter all together. But taking the week to write this chapter was not a loss. From this first chapter, I discovered other scenes and memories I wanted to explore, some of which ended up in this final draft. The only way I knew what those scenes were was by sitting down to write. Chapter after chapter, I found new breadcrumbs to follow. Nothing is wasted effort in the creative process. It's all part of the journey. Writing this book was much like driving late at night in the fog. I could barely find my way with the headlights, but it didn't matter. I knew the road would reveal itself as long as I kept driving. Of course, there were detours and dead ends, but nevertheless, I eventually found my way. And over time, I developed my own writing process and my confidence as a writer grew. It's easier said than done. But after spending my entire life in the creative and business fields, I know that no amount of planning and strategizing will get you to the end of a project until you roll up your sleeves and start. So, where should you start? Anywhere. As Lao Tzu says, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. If you have a book in you, follow that desire. Doesn't matter if you know how it's going to end. What matters is that you start. For some of you, it may be writing to g@genevievekim.com. I'll be here to remind you every step of the way that your story matters. And if you'd like to read the whole book, my book is called Yes to It All. I'll put a link down in the description below. And I hope that gives you a little bit of inspiration for you to just start writing, see whatever comes up, and trust that the process is along the way. And feel free to message me.